In the autumn of 1961, in my study overlooking Lake Zurich, I received a letter that would lead to one of my most chilling revelations about the human soul. The letter came from a desperate woman whose husband had died 6 months earlier from liver failure caused by decades of alcoholism. But what tormented her wasn't grief over his death. It was the terrifying dreams and paranormal experiences that began immediately after his funeral. She described how she felt his presence in their home every night, not as a comforting spirit, but as something desperate, anguished, and eternally thirsty. At 84 years old and nearing the end of my own earthly journey, I had spent decades exploring the depths of the human psyche. But this case would reveal something that went far beyond psychology. It would expose what I came to call the spiritual debt of alcohol, a karmic burden that follows the soul long after the physical body has returned to dust. During our correspondence, I explained that alcohol wasn't merely a chemical substance that affected the brain. For certain souls, it represented what I termed liquid shadow, a materialization of humanity's darkest impulses that once consumed regularly created an energetic bond that transcended physical death. I warned her that when someone dies while still enslaved to alcohol, their consciousness doesn't simply fade into peaceful oblivion. Instead, it enters the realm of perpetual thirst, which means a spiritual dimension where the soul continues to crave what it can no longer obtain. This revelation didn't come from theoretical speculation. I had witnessed it firsthand during my exploration of active imagination and dream analysis with patients who had lost alcoholic family members. In session after session, I encountered the same disturbing pattern. The deceased continued to manifest in dreams and visions, always searching, always desperate, always trying to satisfy an impossible craving through the living. What made my discovery even more unsettling was my realization that this spiritual imprisonment wasn't temporary. Unlike other forms of earthly attachment that gradually dissolved after death, the soul's bond with alcohol seemed to intensify in the spiritual realm. I explained that this happened because alcohol, unlike other substances, didn't just affect the body or mind. It fundamentally altered what I called the soul's vibrational signature. In one of my most detailed analyses, preserved in my personal journals, I described how alcohol consumption creates what I termed holes in the aura, spiritual vulnerabilities that allow lower vibrational entities to attach themselves to the person's consciousness. These attachments formed during moments of intoxication don't disappear with physical death. Instead, they become the soul's spiritual anchors, keeping it bound to the same destructive patterns that dominated its earthly existence. I warned that souls trapped in this condition become etheric vampires, spiritual entities that desperately seek to absorb the life force and experiences of the living to satisfy their impossible cravings. They're drawn to bars, parties, and any environment where alcohol flows freely, trying hopelessly to recapture sensations they can no longer physically experience. The woman who had written to me described exactly this phenomenon. Her deceased husband's presence was strongest in their kitchen, where he used to drink every night, and seemed to intensify whenever she or visitors consumed alcohol in the house. I explained that her husband's consciousness was literally feeding off the alcoholic experiences of others, creating a parasitic spiritual relationship that kept him trapped and prevented her from healing. But my most disturbing revelation came when I explained the multigenerational impact of this spiritual debt. I discovered that souls trapped by alcohol addiction often incarnate within the same family lines, passing their unresolved cravings from one generation to the next. This created what I called ancestral alcoholic patterns, inherited spiritual predispositions that seem to doom entire bloodlines to repeat the same destructive cycles. In my research, I found families where alcoholism appeared in every generation, but always with increasing intensity. I explained that each family member who succumbed to addiction strengthened the spiritual pattern, making it more difficult for future generations to break free. The accumulated spiritual debt grew heavier with each life lost to alcohol, creating a karmic momentum that seemed almost impossible to overcome. During a particularly intense session in 1959, I worked with a patient whose family had struggled with alcoholism for 5 generations. Through deep analysis and active imagination, we encountered what I described as a council of ancestral shadows, the accumulated consciousness of all family members who had died while enslaved to alcohol. These spiritual entities weren't malevolent by choice, but they were desperate, and their collective need created an almost irresistible pull toward addiction for the living family members. I realized that breaking free from alcohol wasn't just a matter of individual willpower. It required the archetypal transformation, a fundamental shift in consciousness that could only occur through confronting and integrating the shadow aspects that alcohol had been masking. I warned that surface-level sobriety, achieved through willpower alone, often failed because it didn't address the deeper spiritual dynamics at play. The most chilling aspect of my findings was my description of what happens to souls who die while intoxicated. I explained that consciousness in its final moments becomes frozen in whatever state it occupied at the time of death. For alcoholics who die during intoxication, this means their soul enters the spiritual realm while still experiencing the disorientation, desperation, and spiritual blindness that alcohol produces. These souls, I warned, become lost in what I called the etheric maze, a spiritual dimension where they wander endlessly, unable to find peace or progress to higher realms of consciousness. They remain trapped in a state of perpetual spiritual intoxication, experiencing all the negative effects of alcohol without any of its temporary relief. I documented cases where such souls remained in this condition for what appeared to be centuries. They couldn't reincarnate because their consciousness was too fragmented and confused to make coherent choices about their next life. They couldn't ascend to higher spiritual realms because their vibrational frequency was too dense and chaotic. They existed in a kind of spiritual purgatory, conscious enough to suffer, but too impaired to find liberation. But I didn't leave humanity without hope. I discovered that this spiritual debt could be resolved, but only through specific practices that addressed both the individual and collective dimensions of the problem. The first requirement was complete abstinence from alcohol, not just physical sobriety, but a spiritual sobriety, which is the state of consciousness that actively rejected the entire alcoholic paradigm. The second requirement was ancestral healing work. I found that individuals could actually communicate with and assist their deceased alcoholic family members through deep meditation, active imagination, and what I termed spiritual service on behalf of the ancestors. This work involved consciously choosing sobriety, not just for oneself, but as a gift to all family members who had struggled with addiction, both living and dead. I also emphasized the importance of shadow integration work. I explained that alcohol often served as a means of avoiding uncomfortable truths about oneself. True liberation required facing these shadow aspects directly, without the numbing buffer of intoxication. This process was painful but essential for breaking the spiritual patterns that kept souls trapped. Most importantly, I stressed that overcoming alcohol addiction was ultimately a spiritual calling, an opportunity for the soul to transform its greatest weakness into its greatest strength. I found that individuals who successfully broke free from inherited alcoholic patterns often became the spiritual warriors, people whose victory over addiction created positive ripple effects that could heal entire family lineages. In my final writings about alcohol and the soul, I issued a stark warning that resonates even more powerfully today. I predicted that as alcohol consumption increased globally, the spiritual realm would become increasingly populated with trapped souls, creating what I called a collective shadow of intoxication that would influence the living in increasingly destructive ways. I warned that this spiritual debt wouldn't remain invisible forever. Eventually, humanity would face the karmic reckoning, which is a period when the accumulated spiritual damage from alcohol abuse would manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored or denied. But I also left a message of hope. I believe that each soul who chose liberation from alcohol struck a blow against this collective shadow, weakening its hold on both the living and the dead. Every person who broke free from addiction became a beacon of light in the spiritual realm, helping to guide other trapped souls toward liberation. As I wrote in my final letter to the woman who had first contacted me about her husband's spiritual imprisonment, the soul doesn't seek perfection to escape its past, but to transform that past into wisdom that serves the eternal journey of consciousness itself. Now, if these revelations have touched something deep within your soul, it's because your spirit recognizes truth when it encounters it. Share my speech so that my warning can reach other souls who need to understand the spiritual consequences of alcohol. Your action today might be exactly what breaks the chain of spiritual debt that has bound your family for generations.